morning, sharing information for this group. You know, it's interesting. My background is all in remote training and remote leadership, because when I was at Progressive Insurance for many, many years, I actually was a remote employee, and most of probably about 75% of my team worked remotely. And so we got really good at this. But even though I thought I knew all of the tips and tricks, I have found that over the last 3 months, I've learned some really fun and different ways to leverage Zoom. So we're going to walk through those options today during this virtual training, and more importantly, actually give you an opportunity to experience some of the ways that folks find it's easier to engage and a lot easier to capture folks' attention. So for those of you who are not familiar with me, my name is Katie, and I am a human resources consultant here in the St. Louis area. I have owned my own business now for the last 4.5 years. That's after 20 plus years that I hate to admit to the actual number, but I think we're getting closer to 30 plus years of HR experience in the corporate space. And as I said, in my corporate space at Progressive, I worked my entire 15 years as a remote employee, and most of my team was remote. And now as an HR consultant, particularly for these last 3 months, we've been doing a lot of training for our clients remotely, including large group trainings. I had teams as large as 45 folks on a group training session, and we're still able to have interactive conversations and get people really engaged. And it's really because of the tools that we're going to talk about today and the approach that we try to take when we're designing the sessions. So as an icebreaker, one of the first things that I'd like to do is have you take a moment and think about what is your biggest challenge in virtual training. And as a way to go through that icebreaker, we're actually going to try the polling option. So I'm going to launch this poll in Zoom, and I'll talk through in a moment exactly how you do this so you can learn the how part of this as well. But I'm going to launch the poll for this icebreaker and ask that you'll respond. So is your biggest challenge in virtual training that you don't know whether the technology well enough, you don't know how to design engaging sessions, you tend to miss the nonverbal cues that keep learners engaged, or you find that learners are too distracted. If you'll go ahead and you should each see this poll on your screen. If you go ahead and select the response that most applies to you, this will start our conversation. Fantastic. And then from there, I'm able to share the results so that participants can see where they fell in comparison with others. This is a trick that I have used in focus groups with my clients over the last 3 months. It also works really well in training so that you know right off the bat where to spend your time in terms of your participants. It's something we would clearly do in the setting of an in-person training, but it's translating those questions and interactions to your virtual audience. And I find it particularly useful. I used this for a client a few weeks ago. We were doing focus groups. I had never met any of their employees, so I needed to build trust very quickly. I also needed to, quite honestly, figure out they were not in a situation where they were feeling particularly comfortable sharing right off the bat. And here you are in 12 little Zoom boxes staring at folks like you're watching the Brady Bunch. Opening up about challenges in the workplace wasn't exactly the most inviting concept. And so the way I set that up was actually to create polling questions prior to the focus group. I would put them up. They were kind of general questions like, I feel like I've received the communication necessary to be effective in my role. And I would put it out there, which gave them the opportunity to respond. And then by sharing the results with the other folks in the group where they can see, gee, I'm not the only one that didn't agree with that particular answer. And so now people felt safety in, I'm not going to be out on this limb by myself if I voice a concern. And so then they were willing to open up. And once we got 1 or 2 folks that would chime in, the conversation really grew. Interestingly, after the session, one of the gentlemen reached out to me and he said, Katie, I fully intended, I wanted to be on the session because quite honestly, I didn't believe that the focus groups would be fruitful. So I was going to attend pretty much to prove myself right, that like nobody would share anything useful on the focus group. He said, but once I got on and you started asking those questions, I just couldn't help myself. And it turned out he was actually one of the biggest contributors to the focus group. And he chimed in a way that was very constructive. He didn't have positive things to say, but he said them in a very positive, helpful way to really help us understand the issues. And so this polling process is really useful. If you're trying to create, if you're new to Zoom in terms of polling, if you go under your meeting settings, you have the option there to create polls. This does not work on the free version, so you do need to upgrade the version, but I will tell you, if you are doing training via Zoom, you absolutely should, it's not expensive, and you should upgrade to the very lowest tier of Zoom still provides you the polling options. You can create all of your questions in advance, and you can create, I think the limit is somewhere between 20 and 25 questions. So if you're doing a long training, you still have plenty of flexibility to use these polls. And again, you can pick, you have the flexibility as the presenter to pick when you want to launch particular polls and get that information going. But what we're going to do today is really walk through each of these different answers and give you some ideas on how to deal with each of these challenges, because all 4 of those responses are common challenges when it comes to virtual training. And so it's either about, do you know the technology, which we're going to give you lots of ins and outs. Zoom is actually very user-friendly, and there are a lot of YouTube videos out there as well that work well, that give you really quick, easy instructions. So if technology is your challenge, I will say I've used a lot of the different platforms before. I've used Zoom. I was actually, prior to this, a huge proponent of GoToMeeting, and I've used GoToTraining. Of the 3, I have found Zoom is a little bit more user-friendly. Again, I was probably the biggest advocate of GoToMeeting going into this COVID stuff. I am actually finding Zoom to be a little easier for participants to access, particularly if they've never done something online before. So if you're doing virtual training with people who this is kind of new to, Zoom is going to be an easier option for most folks. GoToTraining is really the much more advanced version of GoToMeeting. I am really pretty technically savvy, and I even found GoToTraining to be a little on the clunkier side and much more expensive. So what I'm finding in this training is, unless I just need something super robust and complicated, I can get most virtual training done through Zoom, and it gives me all of the options that we're talking through here. The availability of YouTube videos for Zoom is also a little bit more expensive, so if you're trying something new, you've got a little bit more flexibility. Let's talk a little bit about design tips, and again, I'll continue to give you the technology tips throughout the course of today's session. On the design side of the house, it's really important that we think about how we're going to approach our participants in any session. And while that's really no different than it is in person, it just takes a little bit more time and effort. We need to think about the fact that adult learners in particular take in information and learn first by hearing it, also through visualization, and then through the kinesthetic, the ability to actually touch and feel. And what I find when we do a lot of virtual training is we pay attention to the audio and we pay attention to the visual, but we forget to give people opportunities to do the kinesthetic piece, to actually touch and feel this. And so it's key when you're designing any program that you think about ways to make all 3 of those happen. The audio piece, one of the ways you can do that is certainly by making sure, use different types of technology through this. I'm going to walk you through how to use videos effectively in Zoom. It's one of those tricks that actually, I tried it on one session and it was fairly, I had to kind of bail on my plan because it was garbled, but there are some really easy ways to make video work. I've now learned that trick and it works really well. The use of breakout rooms is also extremely helpful. It really, particularly in terms of the audio side of the house, we all learn better when we can talk about our experiences with other folks. And the breakout sessions in Zoom are particularly useful. We're going to do a quick demo of the breakout session since I find that about half of participants have ever experienced this. Andy, your background, your virtual background a minute ago was quite appropriate in terms of the use of breakout rooms. For those of you who weren't in, he had Obi-Wan Kenobi in the background behind him. And I always find breakout rooms for folks feel a little bit like you're coming out of Star Wars or Star Trek. So we're going to give this a quick attempt. Let me find this on, I'm so used to my own mind. Oh, okay, you know what? I may have to, I'll do a bit of a pivot. Lisa, it doesn't look like your version has the breakout rooms. Maybe they're not turned down. That's okay, I didn't think to tell, I asked you about the poll in advance and I forgot about the breakout rooms. So I'm so used to them being automatic. So by a quick show of hands, how many folks have actually used breakout rooms before in Zoom? Andy, you have? Okay, Lance, you have, great. So the breakout rooms essentially allow you to take a large group of people and separate them out in small groups, much like you would do in settings where you would do workshops. So when you're thinking about design, oftentimes when we're doing in-person training, we think about how do we present big concepts to individuals and then break them out into smaller groups to talk about it and have that interaction. And that's hard in these webinar type settings. So we end up, as a result, simply throwing information at people and hoping that they're understanding. What I recommend doing when you're developing your interactive training, particularly virtually, is still think in the same way that you would in person and break your sessions down into small chunks. So give information that gives them the facts, the details, and the data that they need to understand a concept, and then put people in these breakout rooms to share in a smaller setting. This is particularly helpful because we all have, if you're familiar with personal styles, you're going to have your extroverts and your introverts. Well, even your extroverts have a hard time speaking out in these large group settings because you don't want to talk over someone, you're trying to keep yourself on mute, all those kinds of things. On the flip side, when you put people in smaller breakout rooms, it gives you the opportunity to have people have more one-on-one conversations. They tend to talk over each other a little less, and there's a lot of flexibility on how you can use these. With breakout rooms, you have the ability to pre-assign people. So, for example, when I did a DISC training with a client last month that we did virtually, and I separated people out ahead of time based on their DISC file, so that when I went to the first breakout session, all of the Ds were in a breakout session together, and all of the Is were in a breakout session together. That gave them, it was the exact same experience that we would have had in person, but it's simply like it's sort of sending them to the corner of the room, and then I can control the conversations and join each conversation as a facilitator to make sure that people are having the right interaction. Sharing video is another really great way from an audio perspective to make sure that your participants are engaged. This is a tip that, again, we all want to share videos. We use videos a lot when we do in-person training, but how do you make sure that your participants can actually hear those videos is a key piece of that. So in this case, the key piece on this to know is when you are in Zoom and you click on the share button, as you pick which of the applications you want to share, in the bottom left-hand corner of that screen are these two boxes. One says Share Computer Sound, and the other one says Optimize Screen Sharing for Video Clips. You want to make sure both of those boxes are selected so that, one, your participants have a very clear sound of the video, and two, it actually enlarges the video to a regular screen size so that they can see the information. If you don't click either of those boxes, it comes through to the participants as a really, really tiny YouTube video that they can typically hardly see and have some limited ability to hear. It comes through fairly garbled through your own speakers. And so those are some of the key things that you want to do. For time purposes here, I do have time to do a quick demo of what that's going to sound like. I'm going to do a share screen here, and then I am going to my PowerPoint slide, both of my boxes in the bottom corner.
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out, you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower.
Again, just an example so that everybody has the opportunity to see how that particular piece works. It is important, first of all, know that that video, if it looked like it was shaking, it does actually shake when you watch it in real life. And if you're ever looking for a video on change management, it's a perfect one to find via YouTube. So it's probably one of my favorite videos all around. One of the key pieces there from that perspective, though, is, again, testing your computer beforehand, making sure you've got a good understanding of how things are going to work. That is one in particular that I always make sure that we have tested out prior to a session to make sure that everyone's going to have the ability to hear it. One of the other tools that is important to try to use when you're doing virtual learning is to make someone else the co-host. So for example, in this case, Lisa and I are both co-hosts of this particular meeting. The reason this is really beneficial is, on occasion, from a virtual perspective, you will get kicked out from a session, and you want to make sure that you have someone else who can step in and keep the session going. So always make sure to set up a co-host to be sure that you're in good shape. It also sometimes, if you have any other technical difficulties, will allow one person to do something while perhaps you're needing to tend to a technical problem for a participant. In terms of reading the room, one of the things that is really important, and it's probably the piece that people find to be the most difficult when they are participating in virtual settings. And you don't feel like you get that same visual piece, particularly if folks don't have their videos on. From this perspective, a couple of the tips for reading the room that I have found work really well. First of all, ask your participants to use their camera, particularly if you want to interact with folks. The use of camera becomes really important, and it's a great way for you to make sure that you can really see what's happening with the individuals on each of your sides. Now, some of the tools out there have actual, GoToTraining will actually give you a little icon if somebody switches away from their screen and starts looking at something else. It will give you a notification of that. I've tried that. It actually was more distracting for me as a presenter than it was useful in terms of reading the room, but it does exist. The other great part, though, about using the camera is it gives you the opportunity to see individuals. So here's our favorite, sort of Brady Bunch view of things. If you can limit the session sizes in your virtual settings, it actually is really helpful because the top screen you can see, if you've got 40 people across your Zoom screen, there is really no chance you're going to have the opportunity to read the room and know who's paying attention. Other than somebody literally walking away during your session, everybody's going to look the same. On the flip side, if you can keep the room to somewhere between 8 to 12 people, I'm finding that the sessions are much more effective and much easier for individuals to participate in the conversation. It also allows for this. If you have only about 8 to 12 people in a session, then you can encourage your participants to actually use some of the old-fashioned hand signals. I keep trying to remind folks on sessions, we get very into teaching people how to use the reaction section and put all of this information in. And the reality of it is we can just raise our hand in front of a webcam and I know you're raising your hand. So throughout the session, build in opportunities for folks to raise your hand if you've seen. It also build in the opportunity for you to ask questions and ask people to respond by raising their hand. It keeps people engaged and it gets people paying a lot more attention. If you don't know when the next question is coming your direction, you're far more likely to actually stay engaged in the conversation. Those are some of, honestly, when I have been doing virtual webinars, what I've been doing is you have to spend a little bit more time, particularly in training, right? Today is a webinar where I'm just giving you data and information, but in the sessions where you're trying to create interaction and actual learning, you need to get a little bit more hands-on. One of the best ways to get hands-on is the kinesthetic piece. And from a kinesthetic side of things, that's like what we touch and what we feel. The easiest way to do that is to use that co-host option. So for example, if I stop sharing my screen, but I now reach over and ask Lisa, instead, since Lisa is my co-host, I say, Lisa, why don't you share your screen and teach us how to put the video up? Now I can have Lisa actually do the act that I suggested that she do, and I know she's using it. And so whether it's group training or even I've had a lot of clients who are now onboarding employees remotely, and what I'm finding is their go-to in a remote onboarding is to say, okay, I'm going to walk you through this on my screen. And then they hang up the phone and they stop the training session with the new hire. Well, instead, I'm going to walk you through this in my screen. And then Heidi, I'm going to give you the ability to share your screen, and I want you to replicate what we just did. And now Heidi can touch and feel what she's trying to learn, which sets her up to remember it much more clearly. Particularly, some folks just learn by doing. And so you need to use that share screen option to give people the opportunity to do those types of things. Polling is the other way that you can engage the kinesthetic piece without having to do a lot of screen sharing, because simply by clicking on answers, multiple choice type of questions, those work really well. I was co-facilitator for a certification class over the last, it was a 9-week course, and on week 2, we went into stay-at-home orders, so we had to quickly figure out how to move virtually. And during the certification class, one of the exercises when we were live and in person that the facilitator had been doing was putting case studies up on the PowerPoint, and then having a conversation about which answer was the right answer from some multiple choice questions. We were able to replicate that entire conversation online simply by showing the slides with the case study and the questions, and then I used a series of polling questions to have the participants first narrow down the 4 answers to 2 answers, use breakout sessions where they discussed why they picked the answers they did, and then we brought the whole group back and had people pick their final answer. And the learning from that, in fact, by the time we got done with the 9-week session, the facilitator and all of the participants said, you know, that actually worked better with the virtual tools than it did in person. So even in the fall, if we can get back together, if the next group can get back together or in person, I would recommend you using that tool and taking that approach to the session. So we're probably going to do a combined virtual and in-person training, even if we can, from a COVID perspective, do something different, because we found it actually was more effective from this perspective. So the cool part about it is you take the right amount of time for your technology and your design, you actually probably find options that are more optimal than our old-fashioned in-person kind of flip chart sort of setting. So I'm going to go through, there are a couple of questions, Lisa, so I'm going to ask those to make sure that, that I get back to everyone. First of all, Andy, you asked if I'd ever used the Amazon product. I have not, and but I certainly would be interested to see what they've done with the Amazon product. Again, I found that Zoom works, I had not really used Zoom much prior to this, and I've been really pleased with the way it works in virtual settings. So I'll have to go check out that Amazon product. Lance, you asked about, do you need to share the screen to show the video to viewers? Yep, if you do the share screen, and then when the box comes up for you to pick which application you want to share, click that application and click those 2 boxes, and it'll all come up for you. And Great, perfect. I think we got all of the key questions. So certainly gives you some options. Again, design is really important. Think about how would I get people to interact in a room and how can I replicate that virtually? Think about modifying some of your exercises. And most importantly, don't forget, you aren't the only one who can share a screen. So use that co-host option so that you get other participants doing versus simply listening. The other thing I am finding, for the most part, virtual trainings, 2.5, add about 30 minutes onto a virtual training because it takes a little bit longer for folks to get settled, and you need to take a few extra breaks that you might not need to take in person. So I have a 2.5 to kind of walk away from the screen, re-engage, and then use the polling to get them back interactive. So. Thank you so much all for taking time out this morning. I hope this information was helpful. I think, and if we've got time, Lisa, I'm happy to take questions, but certainly appreciate everybody attending.
This is excellent information, Katie. I mean, I thought that I wouldn't go so far as to say Zoom expert, but Zoom knowledgeable. And you have shown me that no, I'm really not all that knowledgeable. And I appreciate learning these tips. Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, one other thing, Katie, is that, of course, you can record once you do a training session, you can record them. And like I'm fixing to onboard a new employee. And, you know, it's like everything I do to train, we're going to record so we have it for future use. And that's certainly helpful.
Yeah, it's really helpful, Andy. And there are a lot, especially for companies that are doing a lot of onboarding, there are some really inexpensive HR technology platforms out there now, where once you've recorded those trainings, you can store them within the HR technology so that future employees, you can actually create, like, here's your onboarding task list, and they include those webinars that you've trained. So I have a client that is in the school setting, and so they have to do the blood pathogen training, something I'm not familiar with, but they have to train it. And they're going to now record that and then house that in their HR technology so that, and require it. And the system will be able to track whether or not people have completed certain training sessions. So there's some really great ways that you're doing virtual onboarding to make sure that you don't have to keep replicating conversations, and they're there for references for the employee, which is even better.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to see you do in the future, Katie, is to organizing and how to organize all your policies and procedures within HR and within your training. So it's like, I've got a bunch of stuff out there, but finding is a whole different world. And if you've got some tips on that for a future session, I'd love to watch that one.
Absolutely, absolutely, Andy. I can get you some information on that. We should talk too. There's some really good, like I said, not expensive HR tools that make a huge difference to getting those things all organized.
Okay, and by the way, don't spend a lot of time on Amazon. It's not impressive. It's
not worth it. Okay, good to know.
We use it at the church for, you know, we have Sunday service and some trainings and some other stuff. And, you know, people pop in and out, and it's real. For me, it's very distracting. So Zoom is a great tool. We use it a lot.
Yeah.
I didn't even know Amazon had a product.
Between the two, I'm finding it to be, I'm actually finding it to be a lot easier for people than the GoToMeeting. So I'll probably convert after, I think, 15 years of GoToMeeting. I think I'm a convert. So.
Well, cost is a big factor too, I would expect.
Yeah.
So,
yes. Yeah.
And as soon as this is over, I'm setting up my breakout sessions for just in case.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to say, I would, Lisa, because you never know, even in a group of 4 like this, sometimes it's just really easy to be like, you know what, let's just pop into a group and have this conversation and come back. A lot of folks from a personal styles perspective do much better in the breakout session piece of it. It's really worth it.
Yeah, I was in a 3-day session where we did it all on Zoom. Now, there was 2 screens of people. So, you know, you sit back and forth. You didn't have the little tiny boxes. But
Yeah.
we used small groups of 6, but then we also got into some interactive, some role play things in the breakout rooms too, and that's real effective.
Yep. Yeah, I've done a lot of role play. You can have a third, if you break into groups of 3, 2 people are role playing, the third person is observing. It's the same concept we would do in person. We just need to do it on video.
Right. Yeah. And again, people don't, again, until you've experienced it, it's a whole nother deal. Mark Breimer did a networking meeting where they did some breakout rooms and some other things.
Mm-hmm.
He said that was a learning experience because he had 100 and some odd people there.
Yeah. The other trick you can do if you have a whole bunch of people on a call and you really can't limit your class size, the other option is, and sometimes even with 12 people, I'll do it. I have 2 of us facilitating so that, for example, in this case, if I had more people, Lisa might be my co-facilitator, and her role is to watch everybody's nonverbal cues and start to send me chat messages first privately to say, like, hey, by the way, Andy seems to be struggling with that, or he's made a couple of faces, I think you hit a nerve, maybe check in. But that way you've got another set of eyes. While you're focused on what you're saying and how it's all working, you've got another set of eyes on both the technology and on the nonverbal piece stuff. Both of those can be really useful.
Katie, this was great. It was extremely useful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
No problem. I'm glad
much,
you found
Katie.
it helpful.
And
no problem. Everybody have a wonderful day.
You too. See ya.
Thanks, Lisa.
Take care.
Together.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
See you soon.
Thanks.